Real quick, you said that you want rationality to be in the service of certain ideals and values that you have, but you didn't say what those ideals and values are. What are those ideals and values?
Absolutely. I would say that the ideals and values that I focus on are sort of the framework that I view life through is the vision of life as a struggle against entropy, lifelessness, decay, and death towards life, creativity, growth, and the impossible pursuit of perfection. A struggle that I recognize is on an individual and perhaps on a species wide scale, a doomed struggle, but a struggle that is worth pursuing. And that's
Oh,
really what animates me.
why doomed?
Well, this goes back to my religious background. Growing up Mormon, I would always say there are all these impossible contradictions and all these things that we necessarily will face down. We are all going to die. We all make horrible mistakes, so forth. But Christ died for us. We can be saved and we can go on to eternal life somewhere else. Now that I have stepped outside that framework, what I am left is the Christian line, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And if we don't, and so far nobody has actually escaped death, and so far as a species we have not figured out a way to escape entropy, and as a universe we have not figured out any of these things, that so far as any of us can tell, and so far as any one who has ever lived has experienced, every individual struggle for these things is doomed, and yet we have built something beautiful along the way. And perhaps we can accomplish the impossible. One hopes we can accomplish the impossible, but we don't know yet.
Man, that's beautifully put.
Yeah. So not necessarily doomed, though.
Not necessarily. We're the hopeful damned. We
Ha.
we recognize the impossibility and the futility of our pursuit in one sense, but we are determined that the pursuit itself is beautiful and that the end, if we can attain it, will be worth attaining.
Holy shit, dude! You could be like a preacher.
Yeah, I mean, look, I one of my big things right now is the idea that we do need a healthy modern religious movement, and I think that it needs to be compatible with secular ideals and compatible with truth, but it does need to be unified around positive values. And so it's not a coincidence. Like, I think that it is important to think in those terms.
Like, I remember when the ACLU was awesome and would even defend fucking Nazis because free speech, those civil liberties, those rights were like our religion, right? This is what we believed in. This was the goal we were fighting for, that anybody could say anything because that is what's important for a society. And I do think it's really important to have ideals and beliefs like that to motivate people, because without that motivation, like, what do you got? You got nothing. You got no reason to do anything. What happened that motivation got abandoned or turned into this new elevate the groups that we feel are oppressed and crush the ones that we feel were oppressors? How did we lose that religious framing for this new one?
I think I don't want to say a quirk of history because nothing is ever exactly a quirk of history. There are always pretty clearly defined reasons. If you want to look at a specific thing, again, I'll go back to the gay rights struggle and say this was really the turning point in many ways. But in particular, and this is where I think people like yourself who had some connection with the New Atheist movement really started to notice something, is for someone like me growing up Mormon, I always felt like I was living in this world dominated by a framework of people who were my enemies, fundamentally, who fundamentally misunderstood and hated my values and misrepresented me anytime they represented me. That's the world I always felt like I lived in. So I didn't, even as I was stepping away from that, I never noticed this major shift in progressive attitudes. A lot of new atheists did. And I think the reason a lot of new atheists did is that gay marriage itself was this extremely unifying battle for this whole coalition. It wasn't a unifying battle for the Christians who were against it. It wasn't at all. But it was extremely unifying. You know, you had years of first pushing against Bush and the Iraq War and everything that a lot of people could get behind. You had things of pushing against fundamentalists that a lot of people could get behind. And you had this grand unifying fight for gay marriage that seemed so good and so right and so powerful. And so a great deal of organization was built up to that end, and a great deal of energy was built up to that end. And then suddenly it ended. Suddenly in 2015 with Obergefell, all this latent energy is just sitting there because suddenly all this fighting that people have been doing and all this organizing that people have been doing and all this passion that people have been building accomplished its goal, and it didn't just dissipate. Suddenly, all of these new atheists who had been able to, all these civil libertarians who had been able to get along with the more aggressive progressives and so forth, experienced themselves being pushed out of the coalition a little bit as this single grand unifying battle was won. All these organizations, if they didn't want to disband, needed to find another fight. And if civil libertarians weren't on board with whatever new fight, then suddenly they were out. And all these other oppressed groups, as it were, or all these groups that conceived of themselves as oppressed in one way or another, suddenly said, okay, now it's our turn. Now it's our fight. But none of those fights managed to be as cohesive or as unifying as gay marriage. But the framework had been advanced so far that suddenly coalition splintered and many more activists were looking around for something to jump on. This goes into my broader philosophy. Back to the Bible, there's this line from Paul: "We fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers." That I think very few people. There's the classic line from Jai: almost nobody is evil, almost everything is broken. And so when I'm talking about negative utilitarians, and when I'm talking about progressives, and when I'm talking about all of these movements, I have met really good and really serious and really sincere individuals in virtually every movement you care to name. So I will rail against, in very harsh terms, the memeplexes that animate people, but I rail against those memeplexes because they turn good people towards ends that I see as harmful, and not because I think that the people within them are fundamentally wrong or fundamentally bad or fundamentally any worse than you or I.
You've been talking a lot about religion being the source of truth, of motivation. I think in your thread you said, broadly defined, religion is the unified source of a person's moral and epistemic beliefs put into practice, which is also great line and one that I tend to agree with, especially in practice. But I think there are a lot of people who would say that it's kind of Spinozaing. It's not a correct definition of religion. Is that okay? Why or why not is that not Spinozaing? And if it is, why are you okay with it?
That's a very good question. That's a really good question, because a lot of people do wish I would use a word like ideology or something like that, and sometimes I humor them and I say pseudo-religion. So obviously, what a lot of people would think about when they are saying religion is belief in the supernatural in one degree or another. But if you look at the religions that have actually existed, the world religions that have actually existed, I would say the unifying thread that binds them is not precisely the supernatural, although the sublime does come into it, and obviously